WIXK เขาโปรแกรมในยา WIXK ที่รุ่นตรงนี้เป็นสกิพงยูชิวัวฮอลลีวูดเกย์ซาดิลูดชอบหัวมันตอนเราไม่เป็นสิ่งที่ก็ต้องใช้เนี่ยตัวตารุ่นตรงนี้plus รงเชียร์เต็มที่ในเจ้าเนี่ย我自己学到我เนี่ยตัวชอบหัวนะจะ知道那必须他ชอบหัวนะจะตัด了แค่ตรงนี้ที่เขาโปรแกรมเราคิดที่他ชอบหัวนะรุ่นตรงนี้ plus ที่ WIXK อีจีตัวส่วน有一個我記是他摸路上記錄中面嘅 plus 但係佢都傾落冇做呢，自己等陣有錄中面嘅 plus 啲學就一個出生到他就第一正正嘅8月，แล้วมีเป็นสิ่ง有錄中面嘅 plus 有令到หูนอที่จะ到อีตัวพูดอยู่有到好錄中面嘅 plus department who was civil rights department 你諗下佢有 Ibrahim我讲你有个的话，去生意时候，我就那必须他做 minimum wage 了要点，给提你了做给我好了，要弄中 Minneapolis，提比出了 minimum wage 呢要起，那你叫我呢，我自己知道弄做必须他说我就那了，他那老公必须他说我就那天就要到好了了，要点叫打到这车么好了，一样个哩，妈妈这车点，我们需要那就很 tax 过了到。หูเรากูตุสต้องเราเจ้านะอย่าแต่รู้เชื่อไปชิตาช่วยจนเราเนี่ยมันลุ้นนู่นจะหูเรากูตุสต้องอย่าเจ้าอีออเปอชาออีไปส่วนเจ้าอีออเปอชาออีไปส่วนกูจะตุเชื่อใจไปยังมองบลอยยาลากขมิ้นเทียนหนึ่งครั้งเนี่ยเราเขากูรู้ส่วนการเชื่อว่าเขาหรือหูในเบอร์ที่ community relations department เขาลุ้นจง Minneapolisตัวป้าลีอยากดู interpret เลยอยากดูใช้รู้ตัวโชว์จวนนู่นจงเชียร์ที่เนี่ยเจ้าเนี่ยว่าจีที่จะพูดอยู่เชื่อเราไปติดหอรู้ใจว่าไปเชื่อตัวมัวรู้กงเชิง 4th of July แล้วอยากจะ freedom festival เนี่ยเราลุ้นจงมินนิอาโพลิสที่ลุ้นจงสิงห์พอทวินซิตี้ที่ลุ้นสิงห์มินนิโซตาวันนี้จีก็ต้องจัดจงเล่นดาวตัวหรือรู้เช่าเทียนหรือขอเช่าเทียนตัวกง的ไปเชื่อนะทอกันนี่เชื่อชีกินเราก็ยังส่งเพื่อที่ถ้าส่งหัวโจนตาส่งหัวโจนต่ออิบราฮิมเจกูยังไม่จะรู้ชัดตัวเชื่อเจลุ้นจงมินนิอาโพลิสนี่เชื่อมามูยต่ออาไปที่ถ้าตาจงเชื่อใจต่อตัวป้ากันยังส่งนักยังส่งก็หาเนี่ย
Thank you. What's wrong?
Welcome to Ibrahim, my fellow colleagues from the city of Minneapolis Civil Rights Departments. Welcome to you, Ibrahim. 在到的朋友 Ibrahim 要到 civil right 路条我好了 civil right 要到伦中面在到个。Ibrahim, I'm going to start with you talking about minimum wage in the state of Minnesota has taken place already. That change has been taking place already. Joining us on this topics, please help us understand the current minimum wage in the city of Minneapolis. ก็ตัวของเราเป็นสิทธาชาวจุฬาที่รุ่นทองมินสังมินสระเราให้สขอตรงที่เทจันให้ว่าเขาเหลือปีหนึ่งติ้งเย่เลยก็ตัวตลอดทองมินเนี่ยเป็น Civil Rights Department ตัวก็ถ้าเราเป็นเนี่ยที่ก็ต้องใช้ชาวจุฬาใช้ตัดสินนอเนี่ยตัวที่เทจันให้ว่าเขาเหลือที่ชับเลยเนี่ยรุ่นทองมินเนี่ยเป็นเยอะจังเลยจ้ะ
Hi, Michael. Thank you very much for having me on your show today. My name is, as you mentioned, my name is Guled. Ibrahim, I work for the city of Minneapolis Civil Rights Department. We do the, among others work, we do the minimum wage work enforcement. And so I'm happy to be on the show today to speak about the current minimum wage and the new different minimum wage that's starting this July. So the city of Minneapolis has had a minimum wage since 2018. It has been increasing each year, and so the current minimum wage for both employers large and small is based on employer's size. And so if you have 100 or less employees, your minimum wage is different than if you have 100 or more employees, right? So if you have 100 or more employees, the current minimum wage is $15. If you have 100 or less or fewer employees, then your current minimum wage as of July 1st, 2023 is $14.50. But and for the large employers, it actually went up to $15.19, so $15.19. So that's the current minimum wage.
nhớ rong share của hỗ lực đó Hậu Civil Rights Department của Ibrahim Guled bé nhớ cho họ bé lúc ở thành đó bé xây ra tụi là một xây sửa chữ cho họ nhớ thì đó cho thành của hỗ lực bị chấp lại của rong share tôi thả nó cho bé họ mình mà quay họ nhớ bị chấp và bé thì đó cho nên hỗ lực tới我大家要大了了天họ bé bị chết cho lúc下令都nó头要比如讲呢，对么就好，你提到就那好来可以差不多，可能别的比的上拍过一老了，这里同到了，你也当接受老了，别么给谈论到才好还得好个几段也好，你也这差不多提到就那好来，别但是呢，别那么差就看到了，到就拉罗老天就拉罗没。bé đâu xa thì vậy thì ở pan này có bé khó nhia chơi cơn rồi thì tôi cho nên họ lựa đâu cho là rồi mẹ do phải tao phải cho nó cho nên người mua ít bùa rồi chơi cha cho họ lựa đâu là chỉ có cục lâu rồi chỉ cho sớm họ do đâu cho là rồi lo nó chỉ em mua cha ít bùa tôi nên họ lựa cho họ nó chỉ có cục chỉ đoàn thế cục cho sớm.
Guled, a lot of people will be asking, who does the Minneapolis minimum wage ordinance cover? Thì trong lãnh đạo tụi anh hoa thì ở lên là rất dài nhau luôn trong Minneapolis này là một chữ phụ và chữ đồng kỳ thể khi chấp lời nhau đó cái hậu lực nhau luôn trong Minneapolis mà yêu từ thế này mua phần chùa là một nhau để rất dài để yêu thế này ba tuần rồi có thà mình chỉ khi đó nên chỉ cái tên này. If I understand correctly, the minimum wage Guled in the city of Minneapolis cover many people. Can you help us understand who does the Minneapolis minimum wage ordinance cover?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Michael, for that question. That actually is one of the most popular questions we get often, is because even though if say you are not outside the state, if you were trying to Google the city of Minneapolis, the city of Minneapolis and all the suburbs will come up in the Google search as one, right? But in terms of who does the minimum wage cover, it actually covers any employee who performs work within the city limits of Minneapolis, right? So that the city limits Minneapolis are a lot smaller, right? It doesn't include the city of Bloomington suburbs, it does not include the city of St. Paul, or even in Edina. So if you are an employee and your employer is based within the city limits, right? So your employer cannot be based in Edina, right? And you live in Minneapolis, and then you go, you drive and you go to Edina, you perform the work. The Minneapolis minimum wage does not cover you. What it does, however, is you can live in Edina and you can drive to city of Minneapolis. And if the work you're performing is within the city limits of Minneapolis, basically means the business has to be located in Minneapolis and you perform the work in Minneapolis, then you're covered by the Minneapolis minimum wage. So it's basically tied to the geographical location, right? So it's a lot more it basically follows where the physical work is performed, right? And then it basically covers all the work, the hours you perform. So sometimes you may be working for an employer where you work half of the, your work days in Minneapolis. You may be traveling, and your other half of work is physically located outside the Minneapolis, then you can have two different. But if your primary work location is in Minneapolis, right, and that's where you perform your work all the time, then if you travel to St. Paul to have a meeting, but then you come back to Minneapolis, you're still going to be making the Minneapolis minimum wage, And so there's a bit clarity on that one. So I appreciate you asking me to explain basically who does it cover. So to sum up, I know I went on long-winded, but to sum up to exactly who it covers, it's basically the physical location of the work, and that has to be the city of Minneapolis.
Ở trong đó khó lù nung có dễ khó lù nên nhận nung chấp lại đi là một hai giờ để cho nên quá lù cho luôn cho mình được nói khó từ thế thì ở trong tính năng từ thế thì nó khó còn mày nó cái chạy còn mà nó thế thì là một chữ đầu đầu lỡ mà là chắc là một hai nó chạy cho chạy đó rồi lo nhà nó những chữ đầu đó số lần số tổ tính năng của họ lười nhớ cho họ luôn cho mình được liền nhà nó do hai tia lần nhau India luôn cho mình được liền nó chạy cho chạy nó chỉ là một đầu lỡ nè giờ bị xả đi giờ lúc tổ sao họ lười nhớ cho tờ y đại nào có nhớ cho họ mình được liền nó chạy cho cái chạy của mày nó chỉ là một đâu có gì chủ tôi nhớ cho họ luôn cho mình được liền giờ thì lúc tổ sao chờ họ lười nhớ cho giờ cái gì đại nào lúc tổ sao nhớ cho mình được liền mà thế thì tổ sao chạy nào thế thì là một đâu có nè giờ thì có chỉ nhớ họ luôn cho mình được liền này nhớ India sự là xử lý sự Paulo là giờ cho rõ nhớ India trong đó mình được liền xứ là chị nó họ nói cho chạy là chịu họ lười được có gì chủ đâu họ lười nhớ cho họ luôn trong mình được liền cho chạy nào thế thì là cho chưa tàu chân cho họ cho nên là giờ hay thì bị xả đi có cho họ lười nè có họ lười in ra nu cho họ mình là beli họ in ra nu có tàu sản trâu lười nó đang để nó chỉ lo cho hắn đó là họ giờ hay thì có những họ lười cho họ mình là beli thì có chỗ tàu mua anh nó mua cái sĩ thái bên dưới đó Mpls thì có tất cả là có cho họ lười cho họ mình là beli nó chỉ cho chạy nó để nó chỉ là một chút tàu được hay thì họ nhảy là thấy nó có cho sắp tới giờ đi chạy nó nè họ nói là cái phát triển đâu cũng hay trong đấy mình chỉ lo là tới mà mỗi cái là một hai tiền cái tiền nó cái giờ hay cho cái là giờ chưa đầu rồi cho tổ xã lý cho nên là tại cái company này nhớ phải chờ họ lười nhớ cho họ luôn trong mình là boli.
Guled, can you elaborate a little bit more, because I think some people may still be confusing. So your physical body has to be within that geographical borders of Minneapolis, not the locations of your employer. Let's say somebody, their employer, the company is in Egan, but then they perform the work, they come and do the work. Partial of their work is to do in the area of Minneapolis. I'm not sure how. Please help us understand that piece. Các bạn thảo mình chỉ là when the you gain the tụi này wow lìa chủ nhỏ họ luôn trong Minneapolis thì có thể li tàu họ minimum wage đó là giờ thì chỉ để có lúc company này nhỏ lên ý kiến nó họ lo giờ thì có thảo mình chỉ họ nó có ít nhiều và sau đó thì ít nhiều tàu mình chỉ xong.
Yes, Michael. Thank you for asking me the clarification. You're right. So before COVID, we didn't get a lot of this question that you asked me now, but we do get a lot of similar questions now, right? Post-COVID, is because a lot of people work from home, for example, right? Let's just say, and if your home is based in Minneapolis, then you're covered now, right? Even though the physical location of your employer may be outside the city limits. So that's one new addition to the minimum wage, right? But the general, when it was originally passed, and the focus was the employee, the person, right? Where are you physically placed where you performing work? And that has to be geographically the city limits. However, there are instances where your employer is based outside the city, right? So the office is, if you either go to check in or if the office is out in Bloomington, but then you come into the city to do the work, now you're covered, right? And so exactly like you said earlier when you asked me the question, it basically follows the person. That's how we like to think about it, you know what I mean? So if you are leaving the city, go to St. Paul, then your physical location is wherever you are. And so, but often there's basically two types of work, right? So if you are a type of work that requires you to physically be at your employer's location, for example, restaurants, you know, if you are working at a restaurant, you physically have to be present, right? For many of the jobs. Then that one, if the employer is in Minneapolis, then you're covered. But then if you're working for an employer where the job follows you, right? So your movement. So if you're not necessarily attached to where the employer is located, but you come into the city limits to perform, but you're still working for that employee, then now you're covered by the minimum wage. So it's just think of where I'm performing the work for my employer, right? And if you say I'm in the city of Minneapolis, then you are covered, and you come under the protection of the Minneapolis minimum wage, which as of today, you know, is a bit higher than the other types of minimum wage that you will fall under, which I'll say more about later.
Được one day COVID nó chỉ cho tao được trả lũ cái nông nó thế à, được sự tập khác COVID nó là chỉ mua tới lũ nông nó do vì tại cho nên do tại nó ô hậu lụy cho hỗ trợ này là nhớ hậu mình là lý lỡ nó chỉ chắc cái đây nó dân hiệu là một do chưa là một chỗ lỡ để giờ hay tại là tụ là lúc tụ xã tụ lúc company là ô hậu lụy tụ chỉ nhớ tụ hậu lúc tụ mình là lý họ do tại tụi nó giờ tạo là nó do tại tụi nó chuẩn tụi nó qua后来呢人家做轮从面的 police 也在讲了人要了么知道到那了这แต่ยังไม่รู้ของการย้อนตัวต่อปีศาจย้อนตัวต่อลงมันทันแต่ใช่ไหมก็ตัว后来ตัวเขาไม่ได้ police แล้วนะเจแต่ลูก company เนาะเนี่ยจีย้อนตัวเขารอ在ใจเนาะยังเรา知道到ก็họ do hay thì bị xử lý có họ lựa cho họ ít lưu lán à hành nó mỏ ít lưu lán à hành nữa anh nhìn nó nhớ cho họ mình là police thì có nhiều chủ tàu tốt cái cho họ lựa cho họ lưu lán à hành nó mỏ nữa để chỉ cho này là chưa tàu đâu có thế họ do cho tin này là họ lựa là cho họ lựa do là trời đâu lợi nhớ cho là một họ lựa cho họ tin hả để doแต่ละตัวhọ lựa cho họ mình là police để trở lại lúc company nó chỉ nhớ cho họ lựa là tốt là cho họ lựa nên vậy cho chạy nó như là một chữ tạo ra lời thế.
Guled, why did the city of Minneapolis need to create its own minimum wage? Help us understand that. Vì lý do lúc trong Minneapolis thì có chủ chỉ cả những món này ý cho chạy là một chữ cái thể năng và cho cái hậu lửa này, thọ các khía thảm mình chỉ đó bây giờ này chỉ cái tên là gì?
Yes, Michael, thank you. That's a really good question, because why is the need for the city of Minneapolis, right, to undertake this responsibility? And the clear answer is the minimum wage in the state, and especially the federal minimum wage, has not increased the past few decades, right? So it's been stagnant. It's stuck at, I believe, if I could be mid to early 2000s, was the last time the federal minimum wage increased, you know, and it's less than half of, I think, about half of what the Minneapolis minimum wage is. So basically what happens is, if the state and the federal government minimum wage is not getting raised, right? And then what happens is the employees' minimum wage is not keeping up with inflation. So inflation outpaces the employees' own minimum wage, especially the state and federal. So the community, especially the residents of the city of Minneapolis, you know, demanded action. They came together and they asked the city to do something. And so the city listened to it. And it was, at the time, the demand was to raise the minimum wage to $15. So the city leaders listened to the residents, and that's how the minimum wage came about. And it was passed and it came into effect, I believe, in 2018. So the city has been ahead of the minimum wage, the state and the federal, since 2018.
把个不是鸟的手我就那了。We may have a connection issue with our interpreter. ขอว่า Ibrahim 不他们这些的头里到上头来了，要录生命的时候了，天要到录的前面干呢，来引起到这东西我睇就真係都冇考慮，要令到頭就cái thể tiến hành của họ luyện nó nên chỉ một trợ lý cho cái nó hậu cái là luôn nhá lúc thì cho nó luôn inflation chỉ cho lên đó chỉ cho nên của họ luyện chỉ là phong cách để hiện là hay cho nhiệt xe cái tàu thì là một khứ tàu nó tàu hậu cho nên đó chỉ cho làm việc sành thì là tàu có chủ cỏ lúc trong Minneapolis nó có chủ long lại cho số thì có chủ là một chỉ cho chạy là một dây trong cái của thể nên của họ luyện nó lại thì là sẽ được nó tàu cho tàu rồi đấy. Thank you so much, Guled. Why do we need a minimum wage at all? And help us understand. Do vì lý do biết họต้องการเราไม่เป็นสิ่ง有主摸เขา minimum wage 了要好的支付个体东西我后来就上架了。
Thank you again, Michael. Yes, that is a really good question. You're right. So the question is, why do we need one minimum wage at all? Is that because labor is not merely the cost of doing business, right? Employees are people, and we expect them to be treated like humans and not objects, obviously. And so work itself, whether it's packaging or cooking or cleaning, it's often less complicated compared to manufacturing. And so if the type of work that employees perform becomes more automated, right? Increasingly controlled by automation, then the employer's need starts to need fewer employees, especially large companies. And so this creates a problem where, fewer employees are performing the work. And so now if this government entities, like the city of Minneapolis, and does not step in to create basic, labor standards, right? So the work we perform within the city of Minneapolis falls under the labor standards enforcement division. And so we want to make sure that the employers in the city obviously do treat people with dignity. And that means, having the ability to, whether you're a parent, a single parent, raising children, or whether you are a younger person taking care of an elderly person, whatever wage you're earning, we wanted that to be at least sufficient enough, you can afford basic living. Is the other question is the current minimum wage, especially it's limited to around 15. Is that enough? That's a different question, right? We can debate about whether it's enough or not, because certainly it's not enough, but that's what the city is able to do at this current moment, is to at least set a floor and hopefully work from there. And so basically the need comes from the ability to protect people and allow them to perform work with dignity, and while earning the better, the minimum wage that allows them to live. So more of there's the other question. Instead of minimum wage, people often call it living wage, right? So and that's everyone's circumstances, it would be a bit different, but the current minimum wage does not necessarily mean it's a living wage, but at least it allows people to get there.
Do vì giá do vì thì họ kể họ lừa nó nữa do ít họ kể nó khỏi nung về là đâu nó thì lúc là lúa sư cho nên họ lừa nó giờ tính năng thì nhà nó giờ chủ đâu 我照用到了其他我个叫是用那个一点的他只要对呀控制 họ kêu họ luyện tụi khinh kia xử lý đi không lo ở trong món nó lo tụ nó lo thế nó giờ nó chỉ dùng gì là một sự là cho tới dạng khỏi nữa họ là cái gì thế cho không tao một tí là một ô giờ họ nói giờ nữa giờ nữa mua đồ rủ tua mua lại để cho nên họ không luyện kia giờ chơi rủ tua mua nhớ trong lúc trong Minneapolis nó nó lời有主到了我个知道，这在了我就好给筛选制造就给我后来呢，cho nên cho company nhớ cho họ cho luôn trong số nó việc chủ đó筛选cho nên我后来就了，咁我弄个些xử lý cho nên là cho nên chỉ là là sẽ tụi mình nhiều lo, là cho nên loại筛选tụi được cho lâu lo. Chẳng cầu chỉ đồ nó như khỏi để nên chỉ là nó để sẽ có nhiều cầu chỉ đồ nó bây giờ giàu thế nó nhớ trong họ nó mình tới rồi họ nói mình ta xin nó mình nhớ họ trong xa nhớ lúc trong mình là beli qua lại thế một họ bệnh sự là một ô tàu ta xin mà do họ kể nó như họ bệnh sự là ô là một ba tỷ thái cho tính năng ô hậu lực cái ô ba lợi là một cứ cái tao nhớ là mình cho lại nhớ thế cho đó là thếแต่是嘛เขาเนี่ย还得这很เนี่ย这更高一路到菜也提到到底那个后来知道菜到的要讲เนี่ย要走了去那我
Guled, why should someone who works on a job that pays them more money than the minimum wage, why should they care about this minimum wage when they make more than the average person who is doing the minimum wage job? Cho cho nên nếu cho họ luyện họ luyện tự nhiên đau là em chỉ cho nên họ luyện thì nó là em cho nên thế chủ sau cho thế bắt sau cho thế tao cho họ thiện thì cho nên họ luyện minimum wage nó.
Michael, so to answer your question, yes, we do have obligation to support the basic health and safety of all residents and community members in our city. So we have an obligation to one another, right? So a minimum wage laws, especially the one in the city of Minneapolis, is one tool for the city to fulfill that obligation, right? To make sure that its residents and community members are paid at least some sort of a minimum wage. And so as a person who does not earn the minimum wage, say I make more than what the current minimum wage makes it, the reason I should care about is because we have obligation to one another as a community members and whatnot. But more importantly, the minimum wage, raising the minimum wage, right, represents economic power, especially immigrant communities and communities of color. So for example, I'm myself a person of color and also an immigrant, right? So I know family members who make less than the Minneapolis minimum wage, but because they perform work in a different city than outside the city of Minneapolis, right? So their wages are lower. So so often they have to work 2 to 3 different jobs to make ends meet, right? So what city of Minneapolis is trying to do, especially for its residents and community members, is to allow its residents to at least have some sort of minimum wage where they're able to make money and then spend that money back on the community. So it creates more economic power within the community, right? So because people, when they make more money, they tend to spend, and they tend to spend back within the community. So it's basically to make sure that our economy is growing while at the same time respecting and protecting the dignity of our residents and community members.
Bé mới khỏi kể là biết sau là một bác thở đâu khỏi kể nó khá hồ thế khỏi kể nhá sáng đâu cho tin nên nhớ cho họ bé luôn đâu thế cho rồi nhớ họ bé luôn đâu bé mới khỏi kể là biết sau rồi ý là một rồi ít tu rất dài là một chút cho khỏi kể thì nha thì chấp lại đâu cho nên họ lười nó ít khó ขึ้นของชีเนี่ยเราหมดป้าว่าก็เตาเขาเกล่ะพี่เสาเนาะเขาเนี่ยนอเขาเกตัวนึงเนี่ยว่าเขาหรือเนี่ยตัวเนี่ยเตาชาเขาเนี่ยเลยเทเจอตีชับเลยเนาะเลยวิธีตัวนึงเลยจะต้องเคจะเขาเทียเขาเนี่ยว่าเตาโดยจะเนี่ยเนี่ยจะเขารู้รอนะคือเตาจะเนี่ยเนาะจะเราไม่ชีเตาจะเขาเนาะที่ถ้าได้ว่าก็จะเขาเกคือละคือ我那落可能他连 game 都用多天，真要就好，喏，这边有是到年了，被么年叫了么是，叫了么我个被路，这热特别叫来落红，就老么用多。
cho nên cái tên cha bây giờ bé yêu short Mpls long ija ya shua ta pe mà đã kalau shita do Ibrahim thiệt một bang cái cũng short hỗ trợ nó bị thắt some minimum wage. We will take a short break and be right back. Continue our conversation with Ibrahim and my sister Bat on WIXK. We'll be right back. Take a break.
Yeah, they know you are the WIXK. I know that. Một đường con vào của họ và chơi cũng ngầu hơn soคุณทำจนเราก็หายเดียวคุณโยนก็ก้อนอินเลยหายสิ
也chỉ một nhẹ chỉ biết thâu lúa ai họ lo chỉ biết thâu lâu nụ nhục lao chao của mà đi rong trao chỉ hở tư trao khó rong rong mà chỉ cầu mong đại sẽ lý có từ bao châu sông mà nhẹ lo dễ mà dân ra thế ngang ba ô shi mà cho lo bi sông cao karaoke lo dễ biết tên lo mù đê mà chỉ có thể biết tu sẽ uốn luôn giá trị chỉ nó uốn tiền nó ya nu tương trẻ do bóng khó mà tao chỉ có mẹ anh luôn giao chỉ hai xe xa tư yêu hoa do tư lo chỉ cho luôn là không là vừa inu mu trao nu còn nu san đến để ngó thơ lu lu sa xie yo tu no tu la chi pa lo dễ có giáo thiên lý trí nhau lưng nhà xéo buồn cho con trâu đua
nhớ rằng là cái tên cha đã các bạn cho sĩ thả số của chúa nó cho Ibrahim thiết một ba nhớ số của chúa nó WIXK chỉ cho số biết thả so minimum wage nó non thầu luôn trong sinh luôn trong Minneapolis thật sự nhớ luôn trong Saint Paul WIXK nhớ luôn trong Saint Paul thì luôn trong Minneapolis how minimum wage Ibrahim what does the minimum wage have to do with wage staff? That's question number one for you. Question number two is and how is the law that you will be sharing with us about minimum wage staff and it's enforced in the city of Minneapolis? Hay trong lúc trong Minneapolis họ minimum wage là cái thị nhiên trong và nên của họ lượng đó, nhưng họ muốn cái chỗ处理cho wage staff là cái nhiên tạo cho nhiên của thầy rồi cho nên以前那念叫念的到超等的了，是到那个我哋叫ใจเราหมู่ชื่อฝือชาใจเราหมู่ว่าตีไทยจะนั่งก็ทั้งมวล wage staff เนาะหนึ่งหารงยา
Michael, thank you for that question. So the two questions I will ask, the first being in the order you asked. So the first question is, what does minimum wage have to do with wage staff, right? And that's really a good question because there is a different law in the state of Minnesota passed couple after the Minneapolis minimum wage, so it's called wage theft. So it's a statewide law that covers the wage theft covers no matter where you live in the state. You could live in Rochester, you could live in Minneapolis or Duluth, right? But so often we get questions, what's the difference? How do they relate to, right? And so the first question is basically, you can think of the minimum wage as part of some of the things that one can have issues with. Minimum wage is part of wage theft, right? But wage theft is sometimes bigger than minimum wage, right? So if wage theft covers more areas, but includes part of minimum wage. And so a failure to pay minimum wage is just one example of wage theft, right? So if the city of Minneapolis says the small employer must pay its employees $14.50 as of July 1st, 2023, then if the employer does not pay, obviously they say it pays $12 an hour to its employees, but it knows it should be paying $14.50, then now not only is it a violation of the minimum wage because he or she is not paying the proper minimum wage, but it could also be considered a violation of the wage theft, right? If we were to take one example. Other areas of wage theft covers that are not just the minimum wage are, for example, not paying overtime after 40 hours of work. So if an employee works 40 hours, except at tiny businesses, right? So the state could be 48 hours minimum, overtime, where the federal is 40, and that it will depend on the size of the employer, right? But in general, if an employee works over 40 hours and you don't pay them overtime, it will be considered wage theft. Not paying all hours worked, for example, is if an employee comes in and performs work before they clock in and performs work after they clock out, that could also be wage theft. Making deductions that are not lawful. So for example, an employer is allowed to deduct from the employee's paychecks, for example, different types of taxes, right? Lawful legal taxes. But if an employer decides, I will just deduct extra $100 from the employee paycheck for unspecified reasons, to something to do with, poor work performance, or maybe that you cover cost of something, those can be considered wage theft because those are not lawful deductions, and the employer is authorized to deduct from the employee. Refusing to pay the employee for the work they performed can also be considered wage theft. So as you can see, not paying the proper minimum wage is one part of wage theft, whereas other areas that I listed, right, the 4 or 5 different areas I listed are also part of the minimum wage theft, sorry. And so there are 2 different laws, right? But one is smaller than the other. So wage theft is a bigger umbrella. It covers more issues, which also includes minimum wage. The second question Michael asked was, how is the law enforced, right? So City of Minneapolis has an enforcement powers in its minimum wage, wage theft, sick and safe time. The different laws that we all fall under the labor standards enforcement divisions are enforced by the Civil Rights Department, right? So their minimum wage has its own enforcement, and wage theft has its own and other laws, right? So the way it's enforced is if we get reports from employees or other people that work with the employee. So often an employee, because they're familiar with the situation, and they say, hey, my paycheck is showing $12, but your city minimum wage is $14.50 as of July 1st. And I asked about my employer, and my employer said, no, the minimum wage is $12, not 14. So then employees can call or go to our website, the City of Minneapolis. If they Google City of Minneapolis minimum wage, City of Minneapolis wage theft, it will come up easily. That's the best way to find it. Our website will come up, and then you can reach directly to us, tell us your complaints, and then we have a standard procedures that we go through, but ultimately, if we believe the complaint has some truth in it, or it's sincere and that we need to know more information, then we launch an audit, right? An audit of the employer. Basically, we reach out to the employer and say, we have received complaint without disclosing. We don't necessarily have to disclose the name of the person who files the complaint with us. So you can choose to remain nameless, or you could give us permission to use your name. But either way, we reach out to the employer and say, we have heard XYZ, and we believe there's reasons that you may be not paying the proper minimum wage, and we would like you to send us the last couple of pay stubs and other evidence to determine whether or not what the employee said to us is true. And so if we get more information and we find out the employer is paying the proper minimum wage, then there's no problem, obviously. But if we find out the employer is not paying the proper minimum wage and what the employee said is true, then we continue the audit. So, and so if anyone has any question, they can call or text 612-673-3012 or call 311. It's easier because if you call 311 and you basically tell them I have a question about minimum wage or wage theft, they know what to do. You could also Google Minneapolis minimum wage or wage theft, or you can go to Minneapolis, mn.gov/labor enforcement. So
only do hay thì họ cái thấy nghe tôi đến hồ lửa cái chấp là họ nói mà đó chỉ là một số họ cái hay thì và tôi sao là nghe nó họ cái mua ở cái nó mà ở cái của mày cháu đó cho nhà nó hay thì họ thấy nghe tới tôi tin là họ lửa thì chấp là giờ đó chỉ là để cho cái nó tới thâu là lời mà lấy họ mới cho hoặc là nhà nó thấy cho nghe xe cho tôi sát rồi cho nghe xe cho thấy cho tin là họ lửa cho cái nó mà nữa là một chú tổ tranh thâu cho tin là nhớ cho họ sang Minnesota để cho để cái nhớ cho là Rochester nhớ cho mình phải là cho cái này nhớ là một chú tổ nó có thể xí nè họ cho cái hay thì nhà họ wage staff này nhẹ này cho tổ tiên họ họ lượng thì tất cả nó mà lo cha cho cái hay thì họ nhẹ thì cho tổ tiên họ lượng tỷ chấp lại do lý trả để xử lý nhớ cho họ mình bảo lý nó thì thọ bí lúc sau thì mình thấy ý ở phần này có bấy lò cho cái dân hay thì cho small business cho là lùa món này tiên họ lượng chơi nữa như chủ đầu thầy họ nhẹ tỷ chấp lại nhớ giờ có bao rồi chỉ cho xem nó giờ thì tôi luôn tổ chức họ là chỉ thấy họ nhẹ nó nè thì họ nói chỉ là 我炒这家中的họ这给在国嘛的mình为họ nhẹ thì chấp lại nên tôi sai chủ đầu thầy đối với thế nào họ lựa thiên nữa như 我炒到这家họ của wage staff nó thì họ给nhẹ rồi anh rồi等等我好lựa thiên其他的呢是要比啥哩？一度的呢，我后来 overtime，呢我大家不就什么的那就好省，这就省了的什么说的这不就有的什么，再给这个买就好，政府 federal 呢就要不就什么呢，这大家不就什么的，也有做到有那么提什么 overtime 咗啦，要的具体呢就可能要我凑在在。我去人这样去我好累天去睇但係就好累到啲呢我好累嘅嘢個搞俾資料咗可能睇xử理到呢度啲呢人哋都冇我好累安低呢là mình nên đầu mồ hay là我好累了人哋整我好累大家人哋đầu mồ tới我好累了去打呢是要係啲lúc company đó nó整接年到多就年係要接到誰这在做了这都谁说呢？就可能你去考或者了我凑这在，要捏了贴贴要的了几个提汤头，就捏了么做一个点呢？ ô hậu lử là do lý do là do họ kể là nhẹ cho nhẹ tổ tinh thần là ô hậu lử thì họ hậu lử thì ở đâu nó thì有注意下，这里好了么知道在在哪，เขาเกเรามาชื่อตัวใจหนอนะเจยอดสิริเนื้อมันนี่เขาเกเรามาชื่อตัวเจ้ามันมันเวสต์แต่เขาเนี่ยติดชอบเลยติดตัวเลยก็จะเท่เขาเวสต์แต่เขาติดเนี่ยจีตาตัวเลยแต่เนี่ยว่าตัวฉันเนี่ยตัวจะเนี่ยตัวเลยเจเขานอตั้งเขาเต้นนอเลยเต้นเซ็กสมองอยู่มองเลยนะเจรู้ labor standard division 我好เลยตัวเนี่ยจนสมมติว่าเขาเนี่ยเขาอยู่เรามาชื่อใช้ชุดใจหนอนะแต่เขานอนเจียแต่ตัวนึงว่าเขาลืมแล้วนะเนื้อยังเป้าจ่อแต่เนื้อตัวว่าเขาลืมตัวเนี่ยตรงนี้จ่าเนื้อเป้าแต่เขาเนี่ยถือตัวตรงนี้จ่าแต่เนื้อยังเนื้อ report เคลียร์ตัวตัวเป๊ะเราจะไปทะเลเป้าจ่อเจียถอดตัวเนื้อได้ report เคลียร์ตัวตัวเป๊ะเลยนั่นเจไปสาลีเนื้อหัดเดียวโอ้แล้วเนี่ยมันเนี่ยสมองตัวเนื้ออีสมองก็เราหลายสื่อแต่ชิมาเนี่ยจะเขาđông là chỉ khó nhẹ kỹ chấp lời lúc đó sai chủ thể đâu là tiếc có bao giờ chỉ cho xem mà chỉ do chỉ bé chỉ là khu chỗ trong đó Minneapolis là chỉ bé mà đi sai sửa nhưng là khi tới tăng mình nó to nó xử lý là muốn Google một số phơi sửa ra lúc giờ Minneapolis là giờ số phơi ra thì khó nhẹ kỹ chấp lời thì đâu đó tụi tính này mình mà wage rồi là giờ số phơi ra mình wage staff là khó kỹ thì chỉ đã nhiều tuổi rồi cho tới nó họ lựa nó kể nó cho nó bịa khi cho tới mình nó cho bé nóจะbé giống một họ kể nó bé một họ thân thân bé là một sai sửa sai ô lý trả lại thế giờ hay là bé chạy tốn cần bao tốn gì nóจะbé là một người họ audit nóจะbé là một hai trăm lúc tuổi sáng là thì nó bé tốn nó thì trong xử lý này thì chỉ chờ đi khỏi nhà chơi cái chấp lại chủ tàu thì tới từ tiếng nào họ lừa lá thì tối nay đại report là một giờ này cho chạy ra khen bây giờ biết khen bây giờ cái giờ chỉ cho chạy chỉ khen là lúc bây giờ tàu tới xí giờ lỡ bé hai đôi lỡ tại lấy chủ tàu mua ở bé lại tôi chế xa tôi là bé rồi bé thay bao sai sửa qua trong sai là bây giờ tôi chờ nên bây giờ là tôi chọn chạy lại là một chờ đi tới giờ thì là tôi chọn lấy cái thì trợ lý khó nhẹ kỳ chấp là chủ tàu thấy đâu lại được chỉ mà tâm mình đó chỉ là họ như họจะ lấy chịu vô trợ lý đó lỡ nó thấy chơi cha khó kỳ nhẹ thấy chơi chấp là chủ tàu thấy là nóจะbây giờว่าhọ được tông một thiên như này mua lúa đất chí nông là mua cái first đất chí nó chỉ là họ hụt tàu tàu下北顺了要chỉ lên để hụt tàu北chỉ打lên là xứ nên muốn Google search phơi tàu hải cho minimum wage là do wage staff thế chỉ打lên đó nên muốn search online nên muốn cho nên muốn đầu Minneapolis mn.gov / labor enforcement no.
Thank you to Ibrahim. Guled, the city of Minneapolis also has a sick leave ordinance, and it's my understanding that it covers time that people may need to get to the clinic, like the COVID-19 vaccine. Can you talk about this quickly before we run out of time? I know we got 6 minutes, but I'd like to get this because a lot of people in the city wants to know what is this sick leave ordinance. Nhớ rằng luôn trong Minneapolis nếu muốn họ chạy là một ba chờ được cho nên chỉ cái tên là họ lớn trong Minneapolis của địa sick leave ordinance là cho chạy của tôi có mua mò lại có một số họ lớn này có tự mua rồi một số là thì mua sát chua nhớ là thì cho lúc COVID của cho nó cho vaccine một sát chua này vì khu này có thảm nên chỉ cho sẽ còn là do đã chỉ điều.
Yes, Michael, thank you. You're right. That's an additional law that the city of Minneapolis and Civil Rights Department enforces. The Minneapolis Sick and Safe Time law basically was covers that when an employee works 30 hours a week so similar to the minimum wage, right? So you have to perform the work in the city of Minneapolis and whatnot. But if every 30 hours you work for an employer is supposed to accrue 1 hour of sick pay, right? So most employers are familiar with, or employees are familiar with the PTO, right? So some employers will give their employees PTO, so paid time leave. You can call it sick and safe time, you can call it PTO, it doesn't matter what you call it, but as long as you meet the requirement, right? So for every 30 hours an employee works for you, you accrue 1 hour sick. And each year you're required to have 48 hours maximum or 80 hours second year afterwards, right? So the most you can accrue for an employee in their first year is 48 hours. And then if that employee stays in second, third, fourth year, they can get up to 80 hours maximum. But what happens is the employee can use the hours and then the employer has to start accruing again. But basically, one of the reasons, I mean, there are many reasons you can use, right? So as long as you have the hours and you call sick to your employer and you say, my school, my child, you know, is sick, I have to go pick it up from the school, or I am sick today, or I have some safety, family related issues that I need to take time off. Whatever it may be, there are a long list of different issues covered. Your employer is supposed to allow you to use, right, when you have the hours. And when you have the hours, you can tell them, I would like to use my sick and safe time. And if you're taking 1 or 2 or even 3 days, your employer is not supposed to and cannot require you to produce doctor's note, right? So some of us, remember again, we talked about earlier the importance of minimum wage. And so if you're only making the minimum wage, most of us may not be able to actually go to the doctor, right, and afford. And so if you're taking the time off, your employer, and you have the hours, your employer is supposed to allow you without requiring you. So, but it's a law designed to, again, help the residents and the employees of City of Minneapolis to have some safety net, right? So things happen in people's lives, whether it's illness or needing the time off. And so if you accrue the hours, then you can use them.
Giờ cứ là mà có hay là save time này cho họ cho nên mò thìต้องการlúc时候là một xử lý là một菜工作thì thái có về cái chỗ lo lời do hay là lời chủ động là một tỏ lại tụi mình nhiều thì mò nhớ cho tụi hồng hiền lo lời do lời khinh mò lời chủ là một túi tín nên nhớ đâu là chuyện này mò do hay là lỡ mua có số mùng non là chỉ là lúc company yêu chủ động chọn lại lọ mũ nhớ cho họ lúc trong Minneapolis nó cho chạy nó bé chú cho chạy nó nhớ cho họ civil rights Federal Department civil rights nó giờ ấy tôi nói họ được bé cho số mùng này chủ động ít số mùng là hay để số mùng sick số mùng món nữa thì nó họ nói chỉ dành cái đi cho họ được cho PTO thì là yêu họ được chỉ yêu thêm đi tàu cho số mùng nó lọ nè do thì yêu mua yêu tổng cần sĩ rồi do thì yêu mua họ số mùng nó là chỉ yêu lúc company yêu chủ động cho chạy được yêu ít xong thì yêu mua nấu con gà yêu mua tàu bao cho gì số mùng cho số mùng món nữa là chỉ là xong thì on này thì mua tàu con gà rồi mua tàu bún mua cho gì cho số mùng mà nên đâu dài như là một sĩ tàu được họ nó giờ hay để có tàu mua món thì có tàu cả sĩ họ nó là giờ có sĩ ý là là bé nu rồi nè có họ chờ họ luôn nè giờ chỉ mua cho chạy là một hay để có cho tàu mua nấu tàu giá nhiều tàu tham một lọ hay để có mua món rồi có thể đi mua tôi chỉ tàu nào là tôi chỉ nói gì nữa giờ để yêu quá họ lười yêu quá họ lười tàu họ nhẹ thể kỹ chấp lại cái này yêu chỉ mua nhẹ là cái yêu chỉ mua chạy nhiều là một có tham một là một tàu cho nấu tàu là tôi thì cho chạyอย่างแต่รู้ตัวท่านเขาจะอยู่เขาเลยโตเลยชิมจะใจเราหัดแต่ก็ยังจะโตมั่วแล้วถ้าหมดแล้วต้นเราไม่โตเลย
Thank you so much to Guled, my colleagues from the City of Minneapolis Civil Rights Department, also for the MUA 把我都采录的时候，就那天种先后呢，你讲我了解你都那必须他，但是呢要背蒙，但是了他比如讲用手会就那，我找到那讲了解，我们让必须他从 minimum wage，那要做给体验，给出来找叫你这个等于我后来鸟到后来种 Minneapolis，那时候他个时候之前那大家种天其他人的 ，Thank you so much again to Guled, Ibrahim from the Civil Rights Department in the city of Minneapolis. Thank you so much for your time. Greatly appreciate the information you provide today. 我找得起，但你叫我牛子星期六我们背后买狗呀，杀动叫WIXK，一起叫手我都杀动的路要找一二，背二下二一背手，要点么领导人的自己的那查，怎么路路铁去杀帮子那就讨好的过了到一些，给他是那个星期六，那看着说。
Thank you, Michael. Glad to speak with you.
Lo umong dia todong ta chin na ku po ku ye niang si ho kong ye con ding dia to sin naวันนอชิลูเฮาชิเกตูปืออีตูตุนรอลูตุนดาลูตุยาวโอลุนยากาเสียรู้เสียให้เดียกูอย่ามองตายว่าเราจ้วลงกูที่จ้าผู้เจตามอแล้วกูเจยอสุดาสุดยาว่ากูคงหมดลม有不多干，我就发到老八婆，写贴包写错，那得错才对。我就发老八婆，写贴包写错，那得错才对。我就发老八婆，写贴包写错，那得错才对。我就老八婆，写贴包写错，那得错才对。